this required. I think I can go. There's something like that. Kind of between different ideas, topics, or different places for expanding and kind of reaching public, the different viewpoints, different ideas, different ways to
and I thought it was
food things, non-food things. We are going to try to around our board members. So maybe that might be something but pretty much for you, definitely aside from development and what we can do to grow. See, if it's not be more than happy to help. So you join. We're here. We're more than happy to help. We're more happy to
what specifically would be the thing that I'm specifically assisting with? And we listed a number of different areas, but certainly there were some ones which, you're more
I didn't sign up.
months, year, that we spend that totally one. Is this just do something out there, we're out there, we will bring more people in terms of demographic, or is this there are a lot of different
working strategically, taking the law. We are, in addition to how to bring people, we kind of also want to see that direction of what things we can provide. There's two other organizations we have that we can try to explore, or ways that we can go not really towards them. So we're trying to get a view of people from lots of different people from different sectors, different districts. We just can't think what would bring them. We all know at some point they start more fierce. So whatever all of these so we just want to get pretty much a broad show understanding of all of them. We feel that they're dedicated to the cause and this kind of thing. So
yeah, I'm totally down with
I think in my car, I'm going to just read my car again just to be safe.
I have a car. Actually, no. Tatiana's car.
Probably, I didn't join the
You
conversation the
don't
other
see
day.
enough. It's very controlled.
So, feel free to reach out. I'll be around. I think your email's probably in the list from one of our older events. Pull up the yeah, no, it's something you're interested in, and then you can look it over or shoot me an email.
Why did you do it?
How are you?
Talk about it, go over y'all enjoy this evening.
We'll do our best. Yeah, so
Yes. Right. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Christopher Ashby, and I'm the Ambassador in Residence at the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's discussion, The Heartbeat, probably Freudian, The Heartbeat of Iran, Real Voices of a Country and Its People, by Kangarlou. World Affairs Council is an educational institution that provides programs and discussions to high school and college students and to the general public on international affairs and foreign policy, with an emphasis on enlightening events and situations in the international arena that directly affect our lives here in Houston. We also organize travel with a foreign policy focus. We just had a group return from Greece, and we are organizing trips to Iceland, Saudi Arabia, and many other destinations. Please check our website for the details, and some of them are flashing behind me. Next Thursday, October 14th, is the Council's International Citizens Award Luncheon. There will be key business and civic leaders in attendance, including Mayor Turner, as we celebrate Starlee Sykes and Al Vickers of BP, the philanthropist and international financier David Rubenstein, in conversation with Mr. Oxy. This is our primary fundraising event of the year. So if you have not arranged to attend, again, please go to our website, wachouston.org, and participate. We also have an upcoming event on October 21st, the State of U.S. Intelligence. Again, the particulars of that are on the website. And I'd like to introduce tonight's guest. In order to introduce tonight's guest, please welcome my colleague, Jack Sims, our Chief Financial Officer. Thank you.
Well, good evening. Many of you may not be familiar with me, but I'm the CFO of World Affairs Council, and I'm not usually in this position, but I'm very pleased to do it tonight. Kangarlou was born in Tehran, and she was raised there, and then she came over here, and she did her undergraduate work at UCLA and her graduate work in journalism at USC, and she's a renowned journalist and appeared on CNN International, NBC, Huffington Post, and Al Jazeera. She is an expert in global refugee crisis, and she started a nonprofit called The Art of Hope to help refugees cope with mental wounds of war. In 2018, Ms. Kangarlou has received the prestigious Ted Sorensen Award by Network 2020 for her reporting on the global refugee crisis. Her latest work is The Heartbeat of Iran, as was mentioned, Real Voices of a Country and Its People. She will be discussing it with her own Ronan O'Malley, and the book gives some insight into the everyday lives of the people of Iran. I'm anxious to hear about these stories, and I'm sure you are as well. So if you help me welcome Ms. Kangarlou.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ashby, and thank you very much to Jack. For any of you who might have an idea about the nonprofit world, and especially those who don't know an awful lot about it, Without a great person in finance and accounting, you're in deep trouble. So Jack, thank you for all that you do. A lot of us, our members see ones of us here and there, but really it's people like Jack behind the scenes who make everything work. So thank you, Jack, for all that you do. And again, like I said, we'll mention at the end, but delighted to have Tara for her book, The Heartbeat of Iran, Real Voices of a Country and Its People. It's a fascinating book. I really, really enjoyed it. For a lot of you who know the topics we often cover and some of the people we bring in, last week we were discussing Michael O'Hanlon, U.S. defense strategies for, China and Russia and North Korea and whatnot. It's very nice to have a book that's so engaging, but also kind of positive about, kind of the real world life of people. So I just want to, thank you for writing this book. I think over the course of the years, any of you, I know some of you in the audience, we've done trips to Iran, as part of our mission. We're nonpartisan to try and bring in Democrats and Republicans, but also present different perspectives for different countries. We've hosted, former Iranian ambassadors, Iranian professors. So I just want to say this is a wonderful addition to that, and really much more importantly, I think, sadly, we've done it ourselves. Definitely happens to American public, American media. It's that we cover the tensions in Iran, we cover the conflicts, the military actions and covert actions, paramilitary actions they do in Shia countries, like Yemen or what's happening in Lebanon and Syria. But we oftentimes forget, or at least maybe don't think about the real Iranians here. 80 million people, large country, about 2.5 times the size of Texas, what their lives are really like. And that's what I really love this book. You cover everything. You cover every ethnicity, every background, from rich people to poor people, connected people. You have, Persians, Azeris, Kurds, Baluch, everything, and then every religion as well. Jack touched upon it in your bio, your unique background of being, American and Iranian at the same time. Could you touch upon that a little bit more, and especially your journalism career, how and why it is that it led you to write this book, and what you really hope people would get out of it?
Absolutely. Well, good evening. It's been a while since I've done this live, so good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here in Texas. I have to say it's my first time in Texas, so what an honor to be here with the World Affair Council and with you all to talk about my book. Ronan, as you mentioned, so much of the reason as to why I wrote the book had to do with my own upbringing, but also what I saw and didn't see in the mainstream media. And by that, I mean, I was born and raised in Iran, and when I moved to the US, I was, about 16, 17, finished high school here, but I always struggled with this duality. Am I more Iranian? Am I more American? Am I not Iranian enough? Am I, how can I fit in? And as trivial and sort of silly that may sound, it wasn't easy to fit in. And it starts from some mundane challenges that you would have in high school and college, language barriers, but it fundamentally then becomes a question of identity, right? And when you are from a country that is only seen through a very narrow political lens, and everything goes through the prism of the government of that country, in ways your identity then becomes defined by that. And I always struggle to fight for my own identity, that I am different from that government. I am different from the stereotypes that exist, right? And this issue of constantly having to explain your identity, this issue, this challenge of always having to prove that you are just like your American counterpart or your European counterpart. That was something I faced in my personal life. But then as a journalist, I started doing investigative reporting, and then I got really immersed in American politics when I was in DC. And again, it didn't matter what beat I was covering or which network I was with. Again, Iran and Iranian stories were strictly told through whatever political event was taking place, right? Whether it's nuclear talk, whether it's whatever it is, it's 99.9% of the time, some rogue behavior or something very negative that the government did, rightfully so, of course. But that's not the full story. That's not the entirety of the Iranian story. And I have to say, unfortunately, for many Westerners, Iran's history starts, on a cold winter day in 1979, 43 years ago almost. But Iran has a long history, 3,000 years to be precise. And that story and that history is worth talking about in the context of its people. And so, I took a break in 2016. I started my nonprofit and decided to write the book and kind of take a break from the TV world, and with the mission of telling the stories of ordinary Iranians from different walks of life, because they don't have the ability to tell their own story, and their story is often told by others. And I always say, Iran is a country of 80 million human beings, not 80 million nuclear heads. And there's a distinction that is worth making there.
And, I think, we'll get into, parts of the book, but just it does a great job of giving the reader an idea of what the totality of the Iranian people are like. I think one thing that's really interesting is, in many, a current theme that comes up in many of your stories is, some people obviously, there are circumstances of, you highlight a saffron farmer who also doesn't have a lot and not many chances, but you also highlight people who are incredible, actors or music people or people involved in some form of, education or something. They have the education or they have the money or they have the means that if they wanted to, they could leave, but they choose to stay. This is their country. They're proud of their country. They're proud of their culture. They're proud of their poets, their writers. Can you talk about it? Like I say, many of the people in your book, why it is that people might say, why would you stay if you had the chance to leave, especially if you're a moderate or you're a reformist or something like that? Why is that such a common thing that so many people do stay?
I don't think, it's very hard to find an Iranian in Iran, or even here in the diaspora, who hasn't dealt with that. We all have a story of either leaving or having someone who we loved leave us, right? And that's a big theme in our world. And it's something that has an impact on us every single day. I left, but my father stayed in Iran. He decided to. He chose to. He was a physician. He wanted to. He could leave. He was U.S. educated, long before the revolution. But so I chose to feature those feelings as well. What does it take for someone to stay in their homeland despite all the challenges, all the while where they can leave, right? But I also want to share this with our audience who may have not read the book. This is not a rosy picture of Iran. It's not a sort of romanticized take on the country. You see many challenges and many layers that really unpack the severity of the challenges and restrictions and volatilities that exist in the society. But again, despite all of those challenges, I think it's worth understanding why people choose to stay and how do they go about their life. And that takes me to the point about narrative building, on Iran. The common narrative that we in the United States and the West have of Iran is this sort of dark, victimized narrative. That these are Russian people who escaped and left and have nothing to hold on to, perhaps, because they had no choice but to leave, right? And of course, so many folks endured, unbearable journeys and circumstances to leave. However, it's important to introduce narratives that demilitarize Iranians and humanize these people through their own stories, through their voices, what matters to them, what makes them move forward. And I think that's why I really focus on that theme. I think one of the cases is, and I don't want to reveal so much, and we can get into this, but in particular, the rabbi, is one of these cases. But I don't want to move too fast.
But I mean, it's a great starting point. I think when you're talking about the rabbi religion, obviously it's the prism through which the country itself is regulated and largely repressed in many ways. It's the most famous theocracy in modern history. But it might also be surprising to let people know that with the sad exception of people of Baha'i faith, that most other religions are generally tolerated and allowed to live their lives as they can. In the book you highlighted a Jewish rabbi, a Zoroastrian a journalist, a Christian, I think it was a restaurant owner, I can't remember. Maybe you let people know, outside of the Baha'i faith, and maybe you could touch upon why that's different, but how others of other religions are able to exist within Iran.
Absolutely, and before I answer that question, I want to highlight this word context. I think in understanding Iran, we need to understand context, and that's something that I really tried to highlight in every single story, and contextualize the why, the how, the so what, right? And quite frankly, I think understanding any country and society, you need to have context. But Iran in particular, has a very complicated and complex history. So in order to understand and be able to maneuver, within the current society and how it has evolved and what it was like before, you need to understand, the context. And I try to add so much of that in these stories, especially the ones that are more so revolving around religion. And yes, of course, I don't know, many folks who know this, but the largest number of Jews outside of Israel in the Middle East actually live in Iran. And that number has dwindled naturally, since the 1979 revolution. But, to this day in the region, there are, thousands of Jewish folks living in Iran, and it's so fascinating. If you go to Turkey, for example, the synagogues, at least to my knowledge or what I've seen, they're tightly secured. You can't just walk in. Whereas in Iran, you can just walk by a synagogue and, you just knock, and if, the rabbi is there, you can, go and say hi, and, even with the churches. So this idea of a militarized country, right, where religious minorities are, hung from the tree, is sort of this dominant image that unfortunately exists in the minds of most folks. And I think these stories help contextualize what happened and what things are like right now, with the knowledge, with the understanding that oppression, restrictions, and stifling of free speech and belief exists. Sure, religious minorities may have representation, in the parliament, how much power they have, right? Or, how much power does anyone really have? So that we understand, but why did this rabbi return? Why does he care to be there? These are the answers that were important to me. These were the answers that I wanted to share with my reader in order to understand the nuances and complexities, because it's not linear. And I think unpacking religion really allows us to see the multi-dimensions and facets that exist in Iran. And unfortunately, with the Baha'is, I also talk about that. It's quite unfortunate. Historically, they've been severely oppressed, and my readers get to read about that as well.
And I think it's interesting, just you think about the evolution of the role of religion influence in politics, or influence in the way people live their lives, or are forced to live their lives. One of the fascinating characters is a 93-year-old grandmother you interviewed, who obviously, a very smart woman, still very capable, still with it. Over these many decades, she's seen incredible change in Iran. From Reza Shah, the Shah's father, in the early years when she was a young girl, and he forbid women to wear the hijab, like a lot of conservative parents or just religious parents, traditional parents. Sadly, they pulled her, and millions of other girls were pulled out of school because she would not be allowed to wear the hijab. So there's an example of religion, or how it's interpreted or put down, denying hundreds of thousands of women the chance at education. Obviously, we get to the roles of the Ayatollahs now and the repression now. It's probably not surprising, but you note that despite all their efforts to instill, Islam and a theocracy in their mind and their way of life, that in a lot of ways they just led to many Iranians drifting away from their faith, drifting away from their belief. Can you talk more about that?
No, absolutely. That's such an excellent point. And again, I truly try to highlight that in the book through every single story, the role of religion. The 93-year-old woman that you mentioned, and this is actually public knowledge, so I'm not really revealing anything that was off the record. She was actually my grandmother, and she passed 2 years ago. Thank you. And in the introduction of the book, I talk about this, this possibility that by the time this book is out, or by the time you finish reading it, some people may have left Iran, some people may have died. But what really remains is their passion for life, and that's really, Ronan, what I try to get to. But with the book, with this notion of sort of moving away from religion, the first thing that I would say is, there's this common line in Iran among ordinary folks that where they say, what the Islamic regime did, it really made people move away from Islam. It really made people not wanting to be religious. And, if you look at the days, during Shah or prior to that, people would have their religious ceremonies, but then they would have their parties. People, would drink their wine, but then, they would perhaps go to the mosque if they wanted to. And so, because religion became so political, ordinary Iranians really became resentful. And in my reporting in the region, there is not much difference between folks in the urban communities and rural communities, in the Arab world. They're categorically religious, and there's not really much distinction and difference. Of course, there's different levels of conservatism. Whereas in Iran, the more you move toward to rural areas, the more you move towards smaller cities and villages, that's where you find these sort of fanatic, super religious conservative communities, and not so much, in urban areas. And that's a very simplified way that I'm putting things. I unpack it in the book. But with Huria's story, my grandmother, I suppose I can say that, she didn't come from a religious family, by the way. We're talking about 1935, I think. So 1935, even though she didn't come from a religious family, they had to, wear the scarf. They had to wear the chador just because it was part of life, right? And so when that norm was broken, her family didn't want her to be an outcast, if that makes sense, right? Not so much because of religious beliefs, but because it's a society where it matters what others say. It's a society where, 1935, you couldn't, just show up, in a dress without a scarf, where, for the past 500 years, everyone was wearing a scarf, right? But then there's another story, if you don't mind, we talk about briefly, because I really want to answer this question as best as I can in the short time that we have. But there's another story of this young woman who was born into an incredibly religious family. Her father was this, heavyweight IRGC official.
The Iranian Revolutionary Guard, basically the most powerful kind of security apparatus keeping the state in place.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so she was born into this family, and she calls her community a colony. I was born in a colony, and she talks about how she didn't have access to any music. The only tapes were Quran. The only books were different interpretations of Quran, and her father's library was her source of books. And now this girl is a kindergarten teacher. She calls herself an atheist, and she listens to Pink Floyd and reads Sartre. And to me, it was so important to capture that evolution of how this young woman, growing up in this family, joining the student Basij in Tehran University, and being one of those girls that, for those of us who lived in Iran, would really run away from, and don't want to have any interaction with, moving away from being that girl to becoming this modern secular girl. And there are so many of Faiz's in Iran, right?
And sadly, in the book, most of her family still disowns her.
Yes, her family has disowned her, but she's living her life. She doesn't care.
I just want also just to note kind of the modern cultural influences in Iran. It's interesting in the book you highlight it has the highest rates of internet usage in the Middle East. There are restrictions, but everybody has their ways around it for whether it be movies or films or books. You even highlight an Ayatollah, he was the former chief of staff of President Khatami, a reformist and moderate himself, that he is a huge music buff, especially Western music, even listens to pop music. Could you talk about what are the kind of outside voices and cultural influences that get into Iran, and are they as prevalent as they are maybe in any other country in the Middle East?
I would say more prevalent. I went to Kuwait for a few days, and you would think Kuwait, it would be open, but it was just so difficult to get a glass of wine in Kuwait. I mean, obviously it's illegal, but it is even more illegal in Iran, more so in ways. But you can just pick up your phone and order whatever alcohol that you want, and it's a conglomerate that is owned by the government. And I mention alcohol partly because it takes me to the point that I want to make about the story of the Ayatollah, where every single thing in Iran that in ways is not permissible by the regime or banned is somehow controlled by them and manipulated. Is a manipulated tool for them to make more money, if that makes sense, right? And I chose this story because I also wanted my readers in the U.S. to get an insight into the duality and hypocrisy of it all, right? I mean, yeah, sure, this guy is a reformist, moderate voice. He's not a radical fanatic, but he was part of a system that banned every single thing that he watches and listens to and reads. Why is that? Right? And that itself shows the rift and divide within the regime, within the government, and how they've evolved. And Ronan, to be honest with you, I really wanted to have a die-hard revolutionary, Basiji in the book, because I also think that it's, for my American readers, I wanted them to read that story next to all these stories of ordinary people, because that would have created a deeper image as into Iran. But then I suppose they get that narrative and story on mainstream all the time. But for fairness and balance, I wanted to have that voice, and so he was the closest I could find. He happened to be a fascinating figure.
And maybe it's another cultural item that I found really interesting was you mentioned the important roles that restaurants and cafes play in society. They play it in all societies. I'm from Ireland. The pub is like the center of the universe of a lot of the small villages where people get together and meet and chat with each other. But because of the restrictions on men and women, especially young men and women being together in public, you note that restaurants and cafes are vital for young people to actually get to meet each other, young men and women to actually see each other and talk with each other. Can you talk about that a bit?
No, of course. And that kind of takes me to my initial reasoning as to why I wrote this book. When you speak with, again, an average Westerner, and I really don't like that word, by the way, Westerner, but folks who are, again, not too familiar with the current society in Iran, the dominant image is this dark gray, closed, oppressive, sort of North Korean-esque image, right? But that's not true. Again, the point is that despite all the challenges and restrictions, people are living their lives. And the question is how and why are they, moving forward within the confines of the regime. And food and cafe and the restaurant culture is huge in Iran, and it has been for centuries. And in the stories where I talk about the food, I really give the history. the cafes and the tea houses and the kebab houses, because this is actually a phrase that I've heard from many folks who've read my book. You get to see Iran within Iran within Iran. With each story you get so much history and culture and art, and then wrap it around that individual. But absolutely, I think even now more than ever, restaurants and cafes have always played a big role in for the youth. In the 40s, 50s, it was a place of gathering for the intelligentsia and the writers and actors, and now that's where the youth are. That's where kids are. That's where they spend their time, and restaurants and cafes are as vibrant as you'd see them in Istanbul or Beirut or Dubai to an extent. But then I give you the contrast of the parts that don't have these privileges and enable you to see the dichotomies that exist in this country, that makes you wish things were different. Also, I would say, within the context of food, I try to highlight the impact of sanctions. And I think one of the stories that perhaps made us truly feel that impact was a saffron farmer.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it just affecting all levels and all aspects of life. And maybe to turn to some of the bigger challenges, really some of the unfortunate challenges for the country. It might surprise people for such a hierarchical and state-controlled form of government like that drug addiction is a major issue, compounded by the fact that it's next door to Afghanistan. But can you talk about, I suppose, the realities? I think you said about 3 million drug addicts in Iran, a lot of them on opium, and then they eventually get onto heroin. You highlighted a really tragic story of a son who basically his addiction began under his father, who was an addict. What's the role of addiction within Iran?
Yes, and that was an important story that I really wanted to cover. I really wanted to tackle the issue of addiction, opioid use, and homelessness in Iran, and child labor. It's an incredibly important issue. It's something that, when I was living in Iran, I would see kids who would sell, flowers or gums, whatever they could find in the corner of the street, and that the number of those kids have exponentially risen since. And so the story of Pedram, came from a middle-class family, just normal working class parents, is a very familiar story to many in Iran, no matter what level of sort of socioeconomic status you come from. The fact that his father was a drug addict, he was an opium addict, parents got divorced. I wanted to talk about the impact of divorce. Right now, divorce rates are skyrocketing in Iran, and it's not just because the couple is not getting along. It's as a result of severe economic and social challenges, right? So I wanted to talk about that, a huge existing reality in Iran, and also talk about how the government in ways does not do much in controlling the prevalence of drug use in the country. So Pedram's story was one that really captured so many of these issues and realities of life, but in ways, I don't want to give spoilers, so I'm not going to say how it ends.
I will say it has a good ending.
Okay,
I think that's okay to say.
yeah.
This one, like a lot of your stories have great endings, and a lot are very hopeful. Could you maybe also, talk about, I suppose, just getting to recent issues and maybe the degree to which the Iranian people themselves are involved, I don't want to say involved in politics, but are, I suppose, maybe somewhat exasperated by it, how many of them vote. We have our own problems here in the United States, obviously, and a lot of other parts of the world. What are the, I suppose, realities of politics now? We just had an election this summer with a new hardline president, hopefully not as bad as Ahmadinejad. President Raisi being elected. And to some degree, just maybe some of our American efforts, have they backfired? That our sanctions have emboldened and empowered the hardliners. The Iran nuclear deal, I know the Ayatollah Khamenei said, I don't trust the Americans, you should never trust the Americans, but if you want to try this deal, you guys proceed with it. And of course, when we pulled out of it, he's able to say, well, it's right, you never should have trusted them. What's the reality in Iran now for politics, and what do you see as the outlook for the kind of hardliners versus the relative reformers, relative moderates?
How much time do we have?
Yeah. Yeah.
I will try to answer your question, Ronan, but I would tackle some key points, which I hope would give a bit more nuance and insight into the political climate among ordinary Iranians in Iran. First of all, one of the main aims with the book was for my readers in the US and elsewhere in the world to be able to distinguish between the Iranian people and the government, okay? And I think these stories would help readers do that, hopefully. The second thing I would say is, obviously, this election was so blatantly orchestrated, and it was just such an embarrassing circus. But people are so disillusioned in Iran. People are so hopeless in their government that we didn't see the same reactions that we perhaps saw back in 2009. The level of apathy has risen exponentially, right? But at the same time, people don't have the financial backing or stability to lose, the final drops that they have to hold on to, the final, dollars that they have in their banks, the little amount that they have. That's where I want to get at. People are struggling to make ends meet. That they would do anything to just, hold on to some sort of stability. If you talk to ordinary Iranians, again, inside Iran, I'm not talking about the diaspora, people don't want another revolution in the sort of classic sense of what we saw in '79. Or, there are folks that look at Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and they say, we don't want that. We cannot be that. And again, Iran is a country of 80 million. It's surrounded by over a dozen land and sea borders. And it's just, nobody can afford to do what has happened, in the neighborhood to Iran. And I remember I was in Iran in 2015 covering the nuclear talks. I was with Jazeera America at the time. And I did a piece on how Iranians feel toward their American friends and their American counterparts. And there was no Iranian, categorically, even the one with, the black chador, who didn't tell me that, we like our American friends, we don't mind Americans, we just have a problem with their policies. But also, Ronan, majority of those people, except the one, with the chador, also equally has a big problem with their own government, right? And again, that's a distinction that needs to be made, is that Iranians are completely disillusioned, toward their government. They are resentful toward the regime, especially with, what we've seen in the last couple of years. But at the same time, they don't really trust, foreign intervention or foreign powers to come and sort of save them. And again, this last election in Iran, it was just, a big circus. And the voter turnaround was so low, embarrassingly, but, no one expected otherwise. And I do feel that, the Islamic regime understands, because they're not stupid, that in order for their survival, they need to engage with the world. This policy of isolationism is not working. And I suppose, they understand that, and you can see that they want to come back to the JCPOA because they can't afford otherwise. The sanctions have been crippling the economy, but all the while, so many people in the government have been making a lot of money because of that. And I would also say that, the last 4 years, the sort of maximum pressure policies on Iran have, like you said, emboldened the hardliners, have prevented any room for discourse and dialogue. And I think part of that reasoning was this presumption that perhaps Iranians would go up in arms and go on the streets and orchestrate another, big movement that can potentially lead to the toppling of the government, which we saw did not happen for various reasons. And so, number one, I hope I answered your question as best as I could. But this is a very, this is going to be a longer conversation. But again, I cannot emphasize on the level of apathy and disillusionment and resentment that Iranians have, again, ordinary people, toward their government. But again, despite all of that, they're trying to move forward. And I try to, in my book, tackle the how and the why of that. Because I think that's worth discussing, which, by the way, I'm sorry, but which only amplifies the amount of talent and potential that exists in this country. If Iranians are allowed to join the international community, if the Iranian youth are able to meet their potentials and are not robbed from the prospect of thriving, they not only would be great contributors to their own country, but the region and the world.
And we touched upon a lot of it already. Your book gets into many more examples of it. But maybe is there one issue in particular we haven't discussed yet that you think might surprise an American Western audience about the Iranian people? You mentioned education. You mentioned, in the book, the fact that many years in recent times, more women are entering university than men. Is there something in particular you think that stands out of a kind of misperception or something a lot of people don't even think about that'll be interesting to hear about?
All of the stories. That was another aim with the book. I really wanted to surprise my readers. Were you surprised with?
Yeah, definitely. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
But when I say surprise is this effort of dismantling stereotypes. And in the book, I have quite a few women, different walks of life, the rich, the poor, the conservative, the secular, some ordinary, some extraordinary. And I would say that, the stories of the women, I think, really would surprise perhaps readers the most, because I think, in my humble opinion, one of the more dominant images of Iranian women is this sort of oppressed, closed, behind this dark veil persona that has no agency, and that's the phrase that I want to get to, no agency, right? But that's not true. Despite all the restrictions, Iranian women have so much agency and exceptional resilience, and that journey and the ability of maneuvering this confined environment is worth talking about. So the whole story should not be, this picture of a woman with a dark veil, with a dagger in her head, or a story of women without men, or so on, but rather how this woman lives and moves forward and fights the fight. That's, I think, worth deciphering, and I try to do that in some of the stories. And again, this is also not to stereotype and say, oh, we have success stories in Iran, and they're great women who are moving forward. But again, it's in that journey. And one of my favorite stories in the book, again, not to give spoilers, is a story of this young environmental activist, because again, the issue of environment is so important right now, whether in the US, Europe, around the world, especially in Iran, because of lack of infrastructure, lack of management, it's a disaster. But this young environmental activist in the poorest state of Iran, in Sistan, Baluchistan, bordering Pakistan, Afghanistan, who just finished her PhD, all the while being blind. And she grew up in a Sunni family in an incredibly conservative community. So I give you the challenges.
And she started her own nonprofit to help other blind children.
Yes, of course, and exactly, the fight for people with disability. And I share this story, Ronan, because you see the challenges, you see the oppression, but then you also understand that young women in Iran can also have male champions. Seema's biggest champion in life was her father, again, an incredibly conservative man. And that tells us something. I cannot help but to think about Malala whenever I reread Seema's story or think about her. And for me, it's important that the world sees Iran having Malalas. And unfortunately, we don't see that. Those stories are not out.
And you highlight some great ones. I'll leave it for you guys to read in the book, but Zara, incredible story. I won't give too much away with it, but Olympic champion in her own way, and how she gets there is pretty fascinating. I invite you all to submit your questions. I know my colleagues are collecting some of those, but maybe one thing I'll just leave it on for you to turn to the audience. You touched upon this idea of most Iranians, especially those who are old enough to remember, terrified by the idea of a revolution, let alone what happened with the Arab Spring in the region, over the last 10 years. Speaking before, we both, I won't say what it is because I don't want to get in trouble, but a prominent Iranian who'd been with the government for many years told me, and I think I maybe told you something similar, he said to me, quietly said, Ronan, he said, we need change. He said, I was in my 20s. I was part of the revolution. I was part of that. I was part of the government. He said, but we cannot go through another revolution. We need evolution. We need gradual change. Do you think that's possible? And I suppose, do you think the Iranian people themselves think that's realistic or even possible with especially now a new hardline president again? I mean, at the end of the day, the Ayatollah, whether it's a reformist or hardliner president, may not matter. Do you think that's possible? And do you think the Iranian people themselves think it's possible? Or do you think there's any chance of some sort of uprising again? Maybe we had what happened with Ben Ali in Tunisia, a overthrow like that.
Which, by the way, we saw what happened in Tunisia. I wish I had the answer, but I don't. The one thing I would say is that Iranians don't want war. I think categorically Iranians, again, we're talking about a country of 80 million, right? Saudi Arabia has 35 million. Iran has one of the largest populations in that region. Categorically, they don't want war. And it's a tricky topic because, in the US, if you talk about within the Iranian diaspora or within, the sort of talking heads of policymakers and sort of Iran thinkers, if you talk about this idea of evolution, you automatically get labeled as a sort of pro-regime or the supporter of the government, which is incorrect. And quite frankly, is part of the bigger flaw in the Iran discourse right now in the United States. For those who oppose war, for those who oppose confrontation, and perhaps see resolve in an evolution domestically, those people are not pro-regime. And there's so many of those people. Now, how much they believe that evolution would happen or how fast that would happen, nobody knows. But the Iranian government itself, like I said, understands that they cannot hold on to power and they cannot survive if they continue to behave this way. And you have to understand that these people are getting old. We're talking about 43 plus years. So, like it or not, so many of these hardliner clerics are going to die. And another, very soon. And another point that I would like to raise is that the believers of the regime right now, they don't ideologically believe in the regime. Rather, their survival comes from that. And I think that's that's important to note that, if they find a way, so many of them, if they find a way where they can, make money and have influence, I'm sure many of them would move toward that camp. But again, talking to Iranians, what I can say for sure is that they don't want war, they don't want confrontation, and they sure don't want to see what happened, elsewhere in the region to happen to their country. And sorry, one more thing I would say is that, if I have the opportunity to perhaps suggest one thing is not attacking those who support discourse and engagement, because in doing so, you're also giving an opportunity to the people to be able to belong to an international community.
All right. And related to what you were just talking about, you touched upon some of it, maybe if you want to just add to it somewhat. Matt asked, do the Iranian people want democracy as we define it in the West?
I wonder if we have a democracy the way we want to define it in the West. Again, it goes back to context and nuance. I think it's so important. In order to understand any country, again, in my humble opinion, we have to know its history, religion, and culture. And I don't think it's a fair assessment to want a country like Iran to be like the United States in short run, or a country like Afghanistan to be like, the UK in short run. It's sort of, apples and oranges, but in sort of the mundane definition of democracy, of course, every single Iranian wants to belong to an international community. They want freedom of speech, freedom of belief, freedom of movement. I don't think there's anyone in the world who doesn't want that. And human rights, basic human rights.
You touched upon it earlier. We're talking about people being supposed to disheartened with the politics, but especially the young are always hopefully the source of inspiration sometimes. Someone asked if the Green Movement by the young people several years ago is now dead. What has replaced young people's for the young people who need a cause? What is there to rally behind? Are there individuals rallying behind, causes rallying behind? What do they do?
Oh, that's such an important question, and again, I hope we talk about that more in the Iran discourse. What the youth want. Again, not through the prism of one protest or the headlines, but the reality is, the last 10 years, economically, the country has been drained. Ordinary Iranians, especially the youth, are suffering financially, economically, and that's what they want. They care about making ends meet, they care about putting food on the table, and they care about finding jobs. Again, Iran has one of the highest number of college-educated populations in the region, but then you find folks who come out of their master's, PhD programs without jobs, and that's what they want. They want to meet their economic potentials and belong to an international community where they can have commercial engagement. Because if they cannot, make ends meet, how can they care about, greater aspirations? So I think, the economic challenges in this country have to be resolved sooner or later, because it's absolutely, utterly backbreaking.
All right. Karen asks, is there any chance you've met another Iranian author of The Ayatollah Begs to Differ? And I suppose just maybe related to that, if you can answer that question, but you also talk about the state of journalism and media in Iran.
Sorry, the first part of the question is
did you know the author of The Ayatollah Begs to Differ? Or
yes, he wrote a review about my book.
So
yes, another fascinating book.
Human, yes. Yeah. Human is fantastic, and I respect him tremendously. The state of journalism in Iran, Iran doesn't have a free press. So again, journalism, the way we define it, or the way it should be defined, doesn't exist in Iran. But then again, there are people who try so hard to tell important stories, and a group of journalists in Iran in particular that I have great respect for are environmental journalists who are working so hard tirelessly to bring attention and awareness to the catastrophic environmental crisis that exists in Iran, and unfortunately, the last couple of months we saw the tragic accident that happened that led to the death of two of these journalists. But again, in the classic sense that we have in the U.S., that state doesn't exist in Iran, and it is unfortunate. And I have to say that in my book, I do talk about that. In fact, I have a very interesting profile of a young journalist who's of Zoroastrian belief. It was so important to me to also take my readers into, the old Persian Empire and the Zoroastrian belief, and he does that all the while. He takes us to the contemporary era and what is it like to be a journalist in Tehran.
And just related to that, obviously the challenges of journalism and open, free press in Iran. What are the ways most Iranians get their information about what's going on within Iran itself and then the world outside?
I don't think there's. Okay, it might be a far stretch, but I would say 95% of Iranians, again, different walks of life, even if you go to remote villages, they have a mobile phone and they connect with some sort of satellite television and they watch, foreign programming, especially, BBC Farsi, VOA, it's funded by the US government, and other sort of expat channels and networks. So they're very connected, and social media over the last couple of years has had a tremendous impact in connecting Iranian people, especially to the outside world. And again, despite all the internet restrictions and filtering and so on, they find ways to connect. Iranians are extremely well-read and diversely read. And that was another point that I wanted to really highlight in the book.
Yeah, you highlight the incredible variety of authors through all periods of time that so many of your subjects read. And maybe just last question of the audience, and just maybe it's a way to, you opened with it, but someone just asked, how often do you go to Iran, and how do you categorize yourself culturally? I suppose, how would you see yourself?
A person, a human being, because I do believe that we spend too much time focusing on how we're defined, by way of our passport or color or where we live. It doesn't matter. And I think COVID really helped us understand that fundamentally, at the end of the day, we're people. It doesn't matter where we're from, how much money we have, or where we work. Fundamentally, our hopes and aspirations, fears and dreams are very similar. And I think after writing this book, I believe in that even more. I'm as Iranian as I'm American. And maybe some of you, if you don't know, you probably will not know I'm Iranian. But one thing I hope would stop happening as frequently is our way of categorizing and boxing individuals because of the country that they came from or the country that they live in. Rather, see them through our commonalities and what we have that connects us with that person. And that really takes me to my last point, if I may, and that is, one of my favorite authors, Kazuo Ishiguro, the Nobel laureate, in his speech, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, storytelling is about one person telling another, this is how I feel, this is what I see. Do you see that? Do you feel that? And that's what I tried to do with the book. I wanted you to see and feel how an Iranian man like yourself would feel and think. Because if only we hear and see how others around the world feel and see, the world would be a much better place.
Excellent. So, way to wrap things up. Again, we're We have Tara's excellent book, The Heartbeat of Iran, Real Voices of a Country and Its People. And she's kindly going to hang around to sign it. I know there's a much bigger audience of you at home. Please, buy it online or buy it to read through Kindle or anything like that. But Tara, I just want to say thank you so much. It was a real pleasure and really a wonderful part of kind of fulfilling our mission to help people understand a completely different perspective and think about people who we may have held in sadly a different light for many, many years. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.